If you think CHOP is a place, you're minimizing the message. I told them I believe CHOP is an idea. And with that idea, you could take that idea around the country and then around the world. Don't minimize the idea of CHOP. Don't make it be a place. I think it's bigger than a place.
That is Andre Taylor, founder and executive director of Not This Time. He's talking about his discussions with the leaders of CHOP, the Capitol Hill organized protest. Taylor, of course, lost himself a brother in 2016. Jay Taylor was shot and killed by Seattle police. We'll be talking about what is ahead for CHOP, police in the East Precinct, as our show continues. And yes, once again, folks, it is Seattle News, Views, and Brews, trying to put a dollop of political perspective into your coffee break here. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. I'm also a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are my own. My co-host is Kevin Schofield of Seattle City Council Insight. Hello, Kevin.
Hey, Brian, I'm over here dolloping on my own.
Indeed.
You don't want to know what I'm
should.
dolloping, but you know.
Right. I'm sure it's a verb in some languages. The coveted role of background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, from the first floor of City Hall, of course, shut down because of the coronavirus pandemic. We thank them for their support. If you would like to support us too, we really encourage you to do so and support local journalism. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. We rely on your support to keep this podcast rolling, so thanks a lot. We'll start with Right Here, Right Now. All right, so right on cue, Seattle weather heating up here right before the 4th of July, and the Seattle City Council with plenty cooking as well. Monday's agenda has a housing and community development plan the council will authorize. This will allocate more federal dollars towards small business stabilization grants, rent assistance, and homeless shelters due to the pandemic. Check done. But I want to focus on what's happening on the Budget Committee meeting on July 1st. We have a new finish line now for this process to try to right-size the city budget in response to the COVID pandemic. That deficit now stands at close to $378 million when you look at budget shortfalls and additional spending needed for the COVID response, this as projected by the mayor's office. So now the council is looking at the end of July to wrap up this process, the final vote of approval on August 3rd. Now, the council did move that finish line ahead 2 weeks because they now have a budget proposal from Mayor Durkin. So, Kevin, let's dive in here. The headline from around the nation, everybody's hearing it, defund the police. I want to start with some simple math. You brought this up in your column here, too. Cutting the police department's budget 50%, as some have called for, at least this year is impossible because the year's more than half over, and just about half of SPD's $409 million budget has been spent. I want to talk about that and what the mayor does want to cut from the SPD, because it is not a simple picture at all.
No, it isn't. So we're coming up at the end of June, 6 months in the year, $400 million budget for the whole year. They've already spent $195 million, so almost 50% of that. So, you know, if you cut 50% of the annual budget, at this point, you'd be zeroing out the rest of the year.
Right. That's not happening.
So that's not happening. So they got about, $214 million left. So, we can have discussions, and there will be very robust discussions about how much of that
Right. Do we cut half of that somehow? Yeah.
What the mayor has said, her big picture is, I want to have a really robust conversation for the 2021 budget on what we do with this. And she's asked her budget folks and SPD to go off and come back with scenarios for what it would mean to cut the budget by 20%, 30%, or 50%. So that's in the process. So they'll have some information. And then she says she wants to work with the community to kind of vet these different ideas and think about, a lot of the notion behind defunding the police is not just cut the police, but let's take that money and for all the things that go on, all the 911 calls that happen where we don't want the police to respond. What are we going to go fund instead?
Right. So and I know the mayor has set aside $500,000 to get that going, that community engagement, so we can try to reimagine the police department, as she puts it.
So now for the 2020 budget, she's found about $20 million of cuts.
Right.
And, about $15 million of that was really just stuff that if the protests hadn't happened, if Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd and all that stuff had not happened, if CHOP had not happened, about $15 million of that would have gotten cut in this process of dealing with the COVID revenue crisis and all that anyways, right? So there's about $5 million of additional cuts that she wants to make, which is, pretty small potatoes in the larger scheme of $200 million of budget left.
Yeah, 2.3 of the remaining budget if you're keeping score at home.
So there's
2.3%.
Yeah, so obviously that's not being received well. The city council is kind of working through their what they call an inquest of the SPD budget, looking for places they can cut, and they're obviously under enormous political pressure from the community, particularly from the factions in the community that have been their political support and their political air cover, to really do more around that. And we will see in the coming weeks. So now, instead of finishing up mid-July, they're looking to finish at the end of July, and that's because the mayor took a couple extra weeks to get her budget to the council. So everything just kind of
which I think was at least partially in response to these different calls to defund the police or whatever else. She worked in some details there.
She did, and some things that what the city budget office said was some of the things that they were looking to cut money on, they sort of backed out those cuts as a point, in those 2 weeks of going back and taking another look at the racial equity aspects of the budget cuts that they were proposing.
And I guess just in looking at this, Kevin, defunding the police and, hey, let's cut the expenditures that are made into riot gear or whatever else. I want to make sure that we dive into that, because I think there's a false equivocation on the part of some people who are saying, hey, you know what? If we have less of this deal where people are carrying tear gas or whatever else, it's going to save us millions of dollars. And there you go right there. That's how you defund the police and put that money elsewhere. I want to make sure that we dive into that a little bit, because that's not exactly what's happening when it comes to fewer tear gas canisters or whatever else. That's not a big expense for the SPD.
We can sort of break this up into two different things.
Okay.
There's like the stuff that police officers wear when there are big, potentially violent events like this, like the the shield that they carry and the riot gear helmet and and the baton and things like that. And then there's expendable things like a flashbang or a tear gas grenade or things like that. So in the first category, all that stuff gets issued to every police officer as they join the police force. Right. Yeah. It's not reissued every year. It's not. So it's basically a one-time expense. Maybe if it wears out at some point in time, it gets replaced. Right. So basically, what goes into this SPD budget for that is an allocation of money to fully outfit new police officers as they join the police, and it's not very much money to go do that. So it's in the order of kind of low tens of thousands. To
right.
And then the second category, the flashbangs and the tear gas grenades and other things that are expendable. Those, some of them have an expiration date, and they get replaced when they either expire or they actually get used in some incident that happens. Right. So the amount that gets spent on that varies from year to year a little bit, but it's in the order of kind of low thousands to low tens of thousands. Right. It's really not very. So if you're looking to recover millions of dollars, you're not going to find it there. Right. Kind of the flip side, though, is the amount of overtime that SPD bills or has to pay to officers for time spent. And it looks like, while for most years the planned and unplanned, events, it's a couple $1 million, if that, for their budget for overtime for police officers. Yeah, it looks like over the last month it's been on the order of $6 million. So that's a bigger hit, but that's money already spent, so they're not going to be able to recover that. This 2021 budget, they might be able to budget less for overtime if they're changing the policies about how the police is going to respond to that. But there's no money to be saved this year on that.
Right. And I guess just looking at all these different pieces here, we are going to see fewer large events this year because of COVID. That's potentially some overtime savings there as well. But just to jump back on that whole idea of the flash grenades and whatever else, I'm in no way endorsing the use of those materials at any stretch. But if you are really talking about reducing the amount of money that goes into the police department, I think there's another piece to the math here, Kevin, because when you have a 911 call that comes in for a homeless person causing a disturbance, do you need a police officer to go to that disturbance? That's one question I know the city council is asking. When you have someone who's dealing with a drug problem or a behavioral health problem, most often, and we've talked about this before, the first line of defense, the first responders, are indeed those police officers. And so when we talk about changing the paradigm here, I'm not quite sure if that means spending less money. You know what I mean? Because you're going to have to send somebody to those calls, and 911 will have to route them or whatever else. But I don't think this is a matter of spending less money necessarily in that response.
Yeah, overall, it probably won't be spending less money. It will probably be just routing it to other organizations. And one of the things that the council is going to be looking at is a deeper analysis of 911 calls and how, what percentage or for what purpose. It turns out that sort of the biggest chunk of them is really parking violations.
Yeah, right.
Turns out. That turns out to be like about 8% of the 911 calls.
Yeah,
is for parking violations.
Yeah, in between that and people calling from the McDonald's drive-through, wanting to know what's wrong with their order.
Right.
Sure.
So they're kind of looking at what are the non-criminal calls, what are the criminal calls, how many of the calls that start out as non-criminal turned out to be some kind of criminal thing where somebody gets arrested or there's some citation gets issued to somebody or something like that.
Right.
So the big question is, when you get a call, do you have to send out somebody with a gun?
That's the big question.
The answer is not that simple, but it's something the council will be working through.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk about some other budget highlights here, Kevin, because the department that is seeing the biggest cuts, at least in Mayor Durkin's proposal, is SDOT, the Department of Transportation. About 24 projects delayed or paused, as they've called it. The Center City Connector streetcar, a high-profile one there. I want to break down some of the numbers here for SDOT. So SDOT is facing a $55 million loss of revenue in 2020. Commercial parking tax, part of that, general fund money, cratering during the COVID pandemic. This out of a budget of about $700 million. So SDOT saying it's pausing work totaling about $58 million. Hope you're keeping score at home. Kevin, making these cuts in an equitable way is difficult when you're talking about racial equity or encouraging diverse, different modes of transportation too. I want to talk about the streetcar project first in light of that, to link up two disconnected lines, really. I know this has support in the Chinatown ID neighborhood. It would help that community. But now even the council's transportation chair, Alex Peterson, is saying businesses should pay for this. Your thoughts on the streetcar?
Yeah, and it's something that, in particular, Council Member Herbal has been
she's not a fan.
A vocal opponent of this. And, there's arguments to be made on both sides of this.
Sure.
And, one of the arguments that the opponents say is the folks who benefit the most from this are the storefronts along the path that the Center City Connector would go along.
Right.
That there aren't really that many people that are going to take the connector from
Chinatown all the way to Lake Union, maybe.
First all the way down to Lake Union, maybe Chinatown to Lake Union.
Could be. Okay.
But they're buses, and why should we be putting rail in the ground to do this when you could have buses? We could have bus lanes there, and it would be cheaper and it would be more flexible. And if we decide we need to have more or less buses or change the route slightly on them, it's way easier to do that than have to change rail lines that are in the ground to do that.
Right. A $286 million project. But I want to make sure I look past that too, because let's talk about what else is pausing here, if you want to call it that. Road work on Sandpoint Way Northeast, safe routes to school near Thornton Creek, bike lanes, including one down on Martin Luther King Way South, a trail extension on Soto. So many different pieces here, Kevin. I know there are a number of advocates, including people looking for more sidewalks, bike lanes, etc., who are saying, whoa, how are we deciding what gets cut here? Because that's a lot of different, a number of different projects that we're talking about here getting slashed potentially.
Yeah, and it's Groundhog Day. This is where This is where these communities and these advocacy groups were with the mayor and SDOT 2 years ago.
Yeah,
right. Saying, hey, you've been delaying these sidewalk projects, these bike lane projects. You really want to move ahead with these.
Yeah,
MLK work has major equity issues.
Yes,
that's just been a high accident thoroughfare for a very, very long time.
Yeah, if the conversation's about public safety, sure, you bet.
Yeah, and it's just difficult. At the same time, one of the things that the mayor and SDOT SDOT has been trying to do under this mayor is to really prioritize like bus transit. Right?
Yeah,
getting bus lanes in there, getting more transit lanes in there to try to just move more people, and that's one way to spend the money. And there are certain equity issues involved with that versus bike lanes and sidewalks and paving projects and things like that. So it's a street paving project about cars, or is about buses and having buses travel more easily. Again, this is a place where there really aren't a lot of simple issues, but SDOT is going to be getting a ton of feedback over the coming weeks on these announced cuts and how they made these decisions and who's really benefiting from this. Yeah,
so a lot still ahead through the month of July on this as the council deliberates over this budget. All right, let's move on to Now Hear This. We're going to try to talk about what's going on at the CHOP, the Capitol Hill organized protest. And I should point out, as of the taping of this podcast here, the barricades that SDOT had put in place to allow for the chop to happen looks like they're being removed. So we're going to keep an eye on that. But there's been a ton of back and forth on this between the police and city council. This after the council passed a ban on tear gas, pepper spray, chokeholds on June 15th. This was just before that fatal shooting in the chop of 19-year-old Lorenzo Anderson. Now, police had already been under a temporary restraining order in terms of using those methods due to the Black Lives Matter lawsuit. Police Chief Carmen Best, she is concerned, though, about what the council has done. She's concerned also that her officers now don't have as many less lethal options, as they're called. She said this to reporters last Monday after the fatal shooting.
A life might have been saved if not for the circumstances created by hasty legislation. I wanted this job. It's no secret. I love the job. I love being the police chief. I care deeply about the community. But we need the council and others to support us and assist us in preventing further loss of life.
Councilmember Herbold not having it. Here's her response a day later on Tuesday at her Public Safety Committee meeting, pointing out the council's new laws are not even in effect yet.
I don't understand how tear gas would have helped to save that young man's life on Saturday when the police arrived after he had been transported out of the area. So not only is the law not in effect, it is really incomprehensible to me how even if tear gas was available, how that would have helped the situation.
Kevin, let's unpack this. Chief Best really seeming to scapegoat the council in some ways for this death in the chop. The council with Lisa Herbold pushing back to say tear gas is not the answer. I'm really struck by this because you can definitely argue it makes sense to ban tear gas for police. It's prohibited by the Geneva Convention in wartime. But the chief is saying in the long term, what non-lethal methods will police have in the future when crowds do get violent? All they'll have is a baton and gun is what she's arguing.
I think, the more salient critique of the city council here is that the city council and the mayor asked our accountability organizations, the Office of Police Accountability, the Office of Inspector General for Public Safety, the Community Police Commission, to go off, look at this issue of what are, appropriate crowd control practices and, tools and weapons, and come back with a recommendation. And those groups are working on that, and they asked the council and the mayor for more time to do that. And the city council, who asked him, was one of the groups that asked him to go do this work, just basically said, we're not going to wait for you. And they just went and passed this ban anyway. Given that the judge already put a temporary restraining order in place, why wouldn't you just wait another week? And let these bodies who, they have the subject matter expertise, they represent the community, let them go deliberate this, come back with some authoritative views on what should be done, and then the city council can decide what they want to do. So clearly, I look at this and I say there's just an enormous amount of political pressure on this council
for the council to do something. They
felt like they needed to respond immediately to this, and we'll see how that works out. I think the OPA, the OIG, and the CPC are still going to come back with recommendations, and we'll see if they match what the council did. And if they didn't, does the council walk back some of this? But, Carmen Best is asking the right questions. I think there are two key questions here. Question number one is, under what circumstances, if any, should the police be dispersing crowds? Right. And then, in those circumstances where we think it's appropriate for them to do that, what are the tools and weapons that should be available to them to do that? And those questions are very much interrelated, right? Because if we decide that, the appropriate circumstances in which we want them to disperse crowds is when there's active violence going on or terrorism or things like that, then the tools that the police need to react to that are different than if we think it's just a peaceful crowd, but one that is causing some property damage, or has been blocking. They've been blocking traffic for 10 hours.
Sure.
Well, and so the city, nobody can get home.
Right. And just to dive a little bit further on this, even the temporary restraining orders, I understand the research that I've seen on this. This order puts these blocks in place for the use of these different crowd control weapons, but the order does have an allowance for individual officers to take reasonable measures to protect themselves and others from threats, and also would allow the use of tear gas if other measures to contain a threat have been used unsuccessfully. So, I mean, really, where are we? That's my big question here. I'm with you that I think the council might have acted a little too hastily here. But at the end of the day, how do we do this?
And again, I think it comes back to these two questions.
Yeah.
And it's a place where there needs to be thoughtful deliberation.
Yeah.
And we need both subject matter expertise and community input.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And just, I think it was excellent, Kevin, how you put together on Seattle City Council Insight, describing this as a tragedy unfolding with the CHOP. Now, granted,
Shakespearean tragedy.
Indeed. Right? Well, I heard a little laugh there. There's there's tragedy and so many different emotions surrounding this.
I was kind of playing my Shakespeare background a little bit. Instead of a comedy of errors, it's really a tragedy of errors.
Right.
Because really just everybody's been making mistakes with this, right?
Right. And just to drop in real quickly, the business community, a number of them up there in the Capitol Hill area, are filing a lawsuit against the city here because they're basically saying, okay, City of Seattle, you allowed this to happen, and look what you did. Help me out with this, Kevin. Yeah, more than
they allowed this to happen. They actively supported it.
Right? Yeah,
if there's all sorts of interesting sort of judicial case law on the extent to which the police have a duty to protect people from bad things happening to them, and there's real limits on that as it turns out, more than you may think.
Yep.
But in a case where the city actively supports this going on, right?
Yeah.
Where they brought in the barricades, they have brought in porta potties, they actually published a policy which says that other than for life safety issues, we're not sending the police into this area.
Yeah, right.
We're
going to take officers out of the East Precinct, for goodness sakes, right?
Yeah, it's like, okay, if you're actively supporting this thing happen, then suddenly there's a really good case you made that you have liability at some level for the results of what happened.
Yeah, I remember seeing that picture of so many different council members there. Councilmember Lewis and Strauss and Mosqueda and Herbold all over Twitter. They went down to the site there and were involved with this protest in the early days. And I think moving from the protest and what I think is a very, very important issue here, of course it is to everybody when it comes to making some real reforms in the police department, talking about racial inequality on a much larger level too. Of course you want to support that, but when it gets down to the brass tacks of setting up the barricades or whatever else, that turns into something different. And that's what's unfolding right now. And just to go further down this path, Kevin, I'm trying to figure out what happens next in terms of negotiations here. How do you truly remove that CHOP? The scene that's right there. I hear the barricades going out, but I just wonder, how do you remove that CHOP? How do you get officers back into the East Precinct without causing another flare-up of violence?
And it's going to be a huge challenge. So, one of the kind of defining aspects of this protest and the ongoing protests every night and the CHOP itself is that there is no formal leadership of this organization. Right.
That's right.
The mayor has nobody to negotiate with.
Yeah.
There's nobody who speaks for this group. This group doesn't act as one, as one united body around these things. So
now even Andre Taylor has been frustrated with the quote unquote leadership of the CHOP because trying to pin that down and really talk to some people has not been easy.
Yeah, so there are a set of community organizers who've been involved with it and have a fair amount of influence. And at this point, the number of people who are there and involved in it has diminished dramatically. And a lot of that you could attribute to the violence and the danger at night.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
A lot of people at this point don't consider it to be a safe place to be at night, and that has really kind of damped down a lot of things. But even during the day, there are a lot fewer people there, and some of the little pop-up shops that have appeared, and free food and clothing and things that are starting to disappear. Parks Department is starting to figure out how they're going to go back in and fix up Callanan Park.
Yeah.
So, but the sticking point is really going to be the East Precinct itself.
Yeah.
And at what point police start moving in.
What a strange chapter in Seattle history. All right, still a lot ahead and still being written, that chapter, I should say. Let's move on to what's next. All right, Kevin, a quick look ahead here. Councilmember Andrew Lewis is working on a town hall with former Labor Secretary Robert Reich on the 30th of June here, talking about his plan, Lewis's plan, for a capital gains tax. Now, he hasn't introduced it officially to the council as of the recording of this podcast, but He told me on Council Edition, which is airing right now on Seattle Channel, if you're checking it out, he really does consider this an excise tax. And I know we've talked about this before. What does bringing in Robert Reich into this discussion here add to this? Is there some impetus that he's hoping to build, Councilmember Lewis is hoping to build here, as he tries to introduce this measure to bring in more dollars into the city council to spend on homeless housing?
So Robert Reich is a well-known economist, former Treasury Secretary, not a lawyer. So there are a bunch of legal issues around that. We'll come back to that, of course, in a minute.
Yeah.
Just from the economic side of this, a capital gains tax is a very progressive tax.
Yes.
It's a great thing to have because it's a tax on investments, right? And there's just a ton of demographic information that shows that the people making income off of investments tend to be the richer people, and not the poorer people.
That's right.
So it is, in a sense, a form of wealth tax to this.
Yeah.
And so Reich, I'm sure, is going to back up that notion and talk about the extent to which that's a really good thing.
Concept, sure. Okay.
The legal issue around this
here we go.
is, what kind of tax this is, right? And if you ask the IRS and if you ask the vast majority of the states, they say that a tax on capital gains is an income tax.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's how we pay it on our own income taxes, right?
That's right. That's right.
Or at least the federal income tax, because we don't have a state income tax here.
Right.
But saying that it is an excise tax is really important to hear in Washington State because of these cases we had around the Seattle proposed income tax.
Right.
That was a progressive tax.
That wealth tax that was ruled unconstitutional by the State Court of Appeals.
Unconstitutional for some very specific reasons, right? And there are a couple of pieces that were tied up around this. So there's a whole thing that says that at least in Washington State, income tax is considered a property tax.
Yes.
But even sort of the reason that's important here is because under the state constitution, if all property taxes must be uniform on the same class of property
across the board. Yep.
So you can't have tax brackets. You can't
cherry pick the top guys. Yep.
Yeah. So and it's harder, but that also means that you can't exempt, like the first $250,000.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Or kind of really cut and slice. So there's a couple of interesting things about what Lewis has said he wants to do with this. One is he wants to provide some exemptions for lower amounts, but he also wants to exempt capital gains tax from selling your home.
Yes. Real estate piece is big on this.
So, if you can make the case as an excise tax, and the argument for that is, a capital gains tax gets applied when you sell something. So there's a transaction there, right?
Yes.
Excise taxes are always on transactions.
Right. The selling of an asset.
So they're going to try to make that case that it's an excise tax on the selling of an asset, and that's what we're going to charge this.
Yeah.
But that's really, really going to be a tough sell. But if they can do that, then it's an excise tax, and they can have tiers. They can really make it progressive. They can exclude real estate and selling your home and things like that.
Right.
But if they can't make that basic case, it's an excise tax instead of an income tax,
then done.
It basically has to be a flat tax.
Yep.
Even as a flat tax on capital gains, it's still progressive because again, this is something that wealthier people have.
Yep.
And that sort of poor people generally don't have.
But
it's not going to be as progressive as they really want it to be.
Yeah, wow. It's so much still ahead with that one, too. And I know that Councilmember Lewis, who, of course, was in the city prosecuting attorney's office beforehand there, definitely has a legal mind at work on this one. So we'll see where he goes here. It's time to start wrapping up the show here, folks. And we have been supporting Black-owned businesses, smaller businesses, cafes out there, as we always try to put a sweet touch, an up note here on the end of our coffee break podcast here with something nice. So, Kevin, here's the deal. I went to Bakery Nouveau in Burien. Amazing place. There's the mouth watering again. I'm going to try to hold this up to the camera here. This, if I may be so bold.
Oh, look at that. That's gorgeous.
So this is a sea salt caramel macaron. And as I take a bite, the challenges of macaron baking. I know you've done this before, Kevin, but this is one of those baked delights that's not that easy to make.
Yeah, well, while he's chewing, so macaron's the cookie part of it.
Yes.
You have to cook at low temperature for a very long period of time, and it's always basically impossible to tell whether it's cooked through or not.
Right. Right.
So you can come out kind of undercooked and kind of gooey and chewy. Maybe you like that on the inside.
Yeah.
Or crisp all the way through. And once you learn your oven and you do the same recipe over and over again, it's easy to figure out sort of the optimal timing. But like if you're like me and you're constantly messing with recipes, like it's like I never know how long this thing is. When I'm doing macarons or something like that, how long it's really going to take to bake all the way through.
It takes some genius. And I got to say, head down to Bakery Nouveau. You can actually look through some glass in the floor to the lower level there to see the confections being made. It's a brilliant setup there. Very, very cool. Thank you very much, Kevin, for sharing that with me and also for sharing all of your insight here about what's going on with Seattle politics.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
All right, next time you want to know what's going on in local politics, give us a listen. Find out what's brewing right here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews. You can reach us via email at seattlenewsviewsandbrews@gmail.com. Subscribe on iTunes or Spotify. Please support us on Patreon if you like what you're hearing, and thanks for listening. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.